Okay. Is it recording? Yes, okay. All right. So welcome everybody. Thanks so much for being here. This is the November 2021 CLDE-KC General Membership Meeting. My name is Lindsay Wolker, she, hers pronouns. I am the Director of the Office of Leadership and Civic Engagement at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, and one of the KC co-chairs, and I'll let Mike introduce himself.
I can find my mute button. Hi, everyone. My name is Mike McFadden, he, him pronouns. I am the Assistant Director of Leadership Development at Northeastern University, and I am the other co-chair of the CLDE-KC.
And we are so lucky to be here with our friend from the Student Leadership Programs KC, Liz Staton, who's going to talk to us about the Anti-Racism Action Plan. And so Liz, if you just wanted to jump in and introduce yourself before I move through the rest of the KC slides real quick.
Sure, absolutely. Hey everyone, I'm Liz Staton. I use she, her pronouns, and I currently serve as the Student Leadership Programs Knowledge Community Conference team leader until this next conference. And I am actually outside of higher education. I work in manufacturing at Mills Manufacturing, a small company in Asheville, North Carolina, North Asheville. We manufacture parachutes for the U.S. military. So I'm super happy to be with you all, and thanks for having me today.
Very cool. Staten. I'm sorry for the mispronunciation. All right, so we just have a few slides for folks, just a few updates on the KC, and then we'll get into the Anti-Racism Action Plan. So just for those of you who might be a little newer to our space, this is kind of the purpose of who we are and why we're doing what we're doing. So for the CLDE KC, we are housed with NASPA, and we are, I think, 4 or 5 years old at this point. Mike, is that true? Yes, so about 4 or 5 years old for our KC, so maybe one of the newer-ish ones. And we really focus on creating a space for higher education professionals, for anyone who's interested in this idea of civic engagement, civic learning, that building a civic identity. What does that really look like? And it looks like a whole bunch of things, which is why a lot of people from our community span all spectrums of higher education and beyond. And so we're happy to have y'all be a part of our space. So you can see here some of our goals that Mike and I are looking towards for the KC. Just to highlight a few of those, I won't read through them all, but collaboration. So we do a lot of partnerships. Obviously, this is one of them with the Student Leadership Programs KC, but we do a lot of partnerships across NASPA with other knowledge communities, but also outside. So within Campus Vote Project, or with Students Learn, Students Vote, or with the Andrew Goodman Foundation, we do a lot of partnerships to help, again, increase that civic learning and democratic engagement in our campus communities. Talking about broadening participation in and support for CLDE work, who's invited into this space, who's not, whose voices are heard, and just acknowledging that and trying to increase involvement and participation to folks who might not have traditionally been in the space. Talking about producing scholarship, we have some blogs that we've done and written on to kind of increase the awareness around civic learning and democratic engagement. And for those of you, again, who might be newer to the space, a crucible moment is kind of the groundwork, almost like the framework of where the CLDE, not movement, came from. It's been happening for a long time, but where really higher ed kind of stepped up its game. And that was in 2012, I believe. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more, you can always Google a crucible moment and kind of understand where this movement really got traction in higher education. So obviously we're the co-chairs. Mike and I introduced ourselves. We'll skip past that. Just a heads up for those of you, so the NASPA annual conference is happening 2022 in Baltimore. Early registration is open. So if you have the availability to do so, please consider it. We have a pre-con session that Mike and I are doing along with some of our campus partners, including like Baltimore Votes and some local members, about the 2022 election cycle. And just, are we ready for it? Is your campus plan ready? Are you prepared for 2022? Do you have steps in mind in terms of how you're going to register students and all the great things that we do during big election cycles? So if you're coming to NASPA, feel free to join us for that. It'll be on Saturday, March 19th. And then just to give you some really brief highlights of what we did this fall. So a couple of things. So it was the 20th anniversary of September 11th. And so we did a partnership with NASPA to develop their official statement around commemorating September 11th. We also did a social media campaign about sharing our higher ed stories about our experiences, because a lot of us were in college or about to enter college or high school or whatever during 9/11. And so we were at the age sometimes of our students who are now in our classrooms or in our offices. And so just sharing what our experiences were like. We had a blog post supporting the LGBTQ plus community through CLDE work. So we partnered with the Gender and Sexuality KC and produced this blog post. We are in the works with the African American KC and the Indigenous Peoples KC and the Latinx KC about some other blog posts up and coming for our KC. We did a webinar, which the title might look familiar. This is what our pre-con will be, just an elevated version of that, a longer version of the election cycle. Are you ready? And then we hosted, thanks to Sarah, a webinar around re-envisioning MLK Day. So had a guest from University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign to talk about just different ways to think about MLK Day and how we're engaging students in reflection and service and community engagement and educational components of that day. And you can see here the recordings if you want to look at any of that, or other events that we've had are available on our YouTube channel. And then lastly, before I kick it over to Liz, we have some openings if you want to get involved in our KC. So you can see our open positions up here: communications and social media, virtual learning and engagement, and we have one regional rep position open. These are also our social media handles if you want to keep up to date on all the cool things that we're posting about. And then we also do have a CLDE KC special interest fund. And so if you're wondering, like, what the heck is that? It's really a way for us to promote engagement in CLDE work. So for example, we are offering 2 scholarships for the CLDE annual meeting that's happening next year. And those scholarships come out of our special interest fund. And so we're looking to put that back into the professional development of CLDE professionals who might not have as much institutional support or funding for whatever reason to attend some of these conferences, to make sure that they can still have a space there. So if you're interested, this is the opportunity for you to contribute to that fund. And I think that is it for us. So I will stop my share. And are there any questions before I move on about just like CLDE, KC stuff or upcoming stuff that we have going on? We did also yesterday, that recording will be available. We did a partnership with Fraternity and Sorority Life KC and talked about what civic engagement looks like in Greek life, in Greek organizations. And so that recording will be available as well, if that's interesting to you. Cool. Then I will pass it off to Liz.
All right. Thank you, Lindsay. And thank you to Lindsay and Mike for your partnership and asking me to be here. We worked with Amy and Spencer prior to you all stepping in. So I had the pleasure of working with them on this terminology guide. And so I'm happy to continue the conversation and hope that anyone on this call is interested in anti-racist work within higher education, within SLP and CLDE, or just generally. I hope that we continue our conversations beyond today. So I'll start with, I'm assuming that folks on this call are interested in anti-racist work, whether that sits you, whether you're in higher education, outside of higher education. So thanks for being a part of today. And I'll go ahead and share, just have some slides to share with you all, or to keep me on track, because I could talk about this initiative all day. Let's see, view. Can everybody see that all right? Okay. So I'm going to start with the initial, really beginning the trajectory of the anti-racism action plan. So I started with the SLP back in 2018. That was my first conference. And then I was with them for 2 years. 2020 was my first role as conference team lead. So in that space, we had our conference in March of 2020. And our initial plan and agenda for our leadership team call for the SLPKC Student Leadership Programs Knowledge Community was to really look at the next year and really start to brainstorm and get together what are our expectations and goals for the year. And then in June of 2020, when our initial call was going to be happening, we were getting word of what was happening around the murder of George Floyd. And so some of us came together and said, we need to completely shift, either take a moment in that meeting to kind of recenter, or just completely reframe what we're going to look at for the trajectory of this year. And so we really opened that space to members of our leadership team who had the capacity and wanted to show up for that meeting to really take a look at anti-racist work and specific to anti-Blackness in leadership programs. So for those of you who don't know about the SLPKC, we focus on, we're a knowledge community that focuses on student leadership programs. So leadership educators, professionals, anyone from practitioners to scholars within leadership education. And so we looked at what does anti-racism look like? And we are far from that mark, is what we came to. And so we got together and folks who had the capacity, resource to form an extra kind of committee to really have those more in-depth conversations and to be able to build out initiatives, joined our anti-racism action plan committee for that year. So we were looking at 2020 to 2021. So we really focused, how do we shift and advance work around anti-Blackness in leadership education. That was our main focus as a team. Out of that committee came quite a bit of initiatives. So we had, I'll focus on the top three, were part of the committee. And then the last two I'll focus on that were kind of really anything around the work we were doing in the student leadership programs knowledge community ended up centering back to anti-racist work. So the book club, we had 4 sessions that focused on the book, Changing the Narrative, Socially Just Leadership. And so we invited editors of that book. So we had Dr. Guthrie, Dr. Chanu, Dr. Spencer, and Dr. Torres join us for 4 conversations. For anyone who had interest in reading that book and doing a little bit of a deeper dive into the chapters that those were edited by. So that was our book club we started with in the fall of 2020. Over the year, we had worked on the terminology guide and then a student activism initiative, which really centered how do we show up for conversations for our leaders who are showing up as student activists. So a resource for leadership educators around that. And then kind of disconnected from the committee, but still a little bit tied back to that was our allyship resource document, which we really framed around very similar structure to the Black Lives Matter document that you'll find on their website. So really great resources there. And then we have luncheon leads where we do, we had monthly, we've had a little bit less just as the trajectory of this year has happened, luncheon leads that focus on a topic of interest to either the leadership team or members of our field. And so we had 2. Our first one, we introduced the anti-racism action plan. And then the second, we invited one of our scholars of color who's on our leadership team. His name is Jordan Harper. And he talked about a new resource he was rolling out with NASPA, the Leadership for Liberation framework. And so those were 2 really great conversations that we were able to have in an intimate way and virtually. So, you know, folks across the nation and internationally could join that conversation as well. So today I'll be talking specifically about the terminology guide, which we partnered with the CLDE KC last year on. So the leadership really came from Dr. Jasmine Collins, who is our liaison between the 2 KCs. So we've been very lucky to have her. She does brilliant work. And so there were others on that team as well. We had, as I mentioned, Spencer and Amy. We had Gia, who was on the SLPKC. Allende was working with Dr. Collins on her campus. We also had Colleen Daugherty, a part of NASPA staff at that time. And then one of our editors that was extremely helpful with Dr. Collins was Aracho. So thank you to all of them who were able to support this initiative. I wanted to make sure you knew who was on that team. So really looking at the mission of the guide, really look, and this we frame out in the very beginning of the guide. So once it's ready to publish and you get your eyes on it, you'll see it broken down much more in depth. But I wanted to at least grab the mission from you. So really looking at the establishment and the recognition of a common language that we used within and across leadership programs, civic engagement, and also the diversity, equity, and inclusion and social justice work that we see on college campuses. So this guide specifically draws on knowledge produced from a variety of communication forms and formats, and those were both within and outside of academia, but really keeping that focus on the application relevant to higher education. And so we hope that this serves all in all as a valuable resource within higher education and student affairs. And I'll talk more about the rollout later, but we hope that this is a resource within our KCs, but beyond that as well. And actually, before I move to that, I'm going to show you the guide. So just to give a brief, just an initial look. So in terms of rollout, I'll go into that a little bit after I share this with you.
And this is a sneak peek, y'all. Lots of people have not seen this yet, so you're on the inside track.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Lindsay. So like I said, this initial piece really breaks down our mission and what the ultimate thought process was as we were building out this terminology guide. So one thing I don't know if I mentioned this in the creation, initially we were really wanting to find, you hear a lot of times there's all these, if you go to another campus and you hear diversity or even another office, you might be saying diversity and meaning two completely different things. And so we wanted a resource that across higher ed, you could share a common language and come back to a resource that we thought would be helpful. And the words and definitions that we use, and this was from a collective. And so as we move forward and maintain this guide, things will shift and change and we will build it better and greater. But this was from our collective, what we found as some common language that we thought would be helpful. So we broke it down in alphabetical order. So you'll see some words that'll probably stick out to you. So a lot of words around diversity, equity, and inclusion, activism, and social justice. So I'll just kind of scroll that to give you an idea. And then I'll go to the very bottom. So this actually came from Spencer, I believe, who at the bottom broke down for us. Let me grab it. The CLDE emergent theory of change. So there are specific, we were trying to decide, do we want to house these within each, or do we want to break those down separately? So those are at the bottom in their own section. So you've got the definitions that come out of that CLDE emergent theory of change. So as you saw, each definition, we have the citation within the document, but then we have those resources listed out for you at the bottom as well. So just to kind of, let me go back. Oop. Same one. I'll try that again. So kind of where we sit right now, and I was updating Lindsay prior to our call, we actually had some transition time frame with our liaison to NASPA staff. And so we were initially trying to get an answer on if we wanted to make this a citable document for folks who are either using it in scholarly work or any type of work they wanted to be able to cite this guide. What's a way we could do that? And so as our person transitioned out, we just got into conversations with our new liaison who let us know there's more of a long-term trajectory for including NASPA in a NASPA working group. And so her advice was to go ahead, get this document out there, and she'd be more than happy to go ahead and give this to all of the KCs so they have it all as a resource, and that we could house this document within the CLDE and SLPKC websites, but just to go ahead and move forward. So we actually were waiting to get the final go ahead before including our other documents. So we'll have 3 that come out, including the terminology guide. So we have our allyship resource document that will be another guide. And then the student activism initiative is actually 2 documents that will come out, more like an infographic, a little bit more engaging type of conversation starter with the student activism initiative. So the only thing I'm waiting on, I wanted to give it to Dr. Collins, one last final PDF review on the terminology guide. So once we have that, we'll be able to really follow up with rolling out all of these on our social media and loading these on our website. So so that's kind of where we stand at this point. And we'll have future conversations. We've talked a little bit about where does this live beyond where it sits right now? So we know with the KCs being volunteer based, kind of outside of our normal role, what's a way that we could best house this so that it's always updated and always available for folks moving forward. And then that last point I wanted to capture, that if we do decide to make this a NASPA associated guide, that will be a future step if that's something that the CLDE and SLPKC decides to do. So I talked about that a little bit. And in terms of the NASPA working group, they did mention that would give time for what takes the time with that group is a lot more voices are coming in. And so we hope that as we continue, either if we're doing a NASPA associated guide or just along the way as we're including other KCs, we hope that those edits and adjustments can come through just kind of as a natural progression through the years. So it's kind of our hope with that. So I did want to mention, we have a few things coming up around anti-racist work. So we have developed a committee that will be this same kind of, and we say there's no structure. We wanted to invite folks in and really create initiatives that they thought would be impactful to the field. So when I say structure, we really are structureless. But we have another committee that will be working from the 2021 to 2022 conference season. So we actually had started last year with our leadership team, and we opened that up to our membership, and we have 14 members. So it's a very solid group, and a lot of different voices coming from different functional areas and institutions. So we're really excited to be working with them this year. So at this point, we have some focus areas, and they'll be building out. They're in the brainstorming phase of what that's going to look like and what they hope to see. So we're looking at frameworks and theories around anti-racism, and that is specific to leadership education. We're again looking at student activism as leadership. We're looking at calls to action. So something that came up was we had a lot of like book clubs and conversations, and where's this, what happened after that? So if we had a predominantly white book club, what's the action after that? So kind of having some conversations around what happened and where does accountability sit within anti-racist work. We also talked about, or we'll focus on aspects of anti-racist work and leadership. So really naming some of those, kind of how does racism show up as we look at it specifically. And that will all in all likely tie back to the frameworks and theories, but that's something our group really wanted to focus on. What are those individual aspects and how are we naming those? And then something we talked about in year one, but we wanted to take some time and be thoughtful about was creating a white accountability space. So if you've ever been to NCORE or the National Conference on Race and Ethnicity, they hold a white accountability space. And so we've talked about how do we create that thoughtfully and how can we model that for student leadership programs for our white students who are wanting to show up in this work. So yeah, just to close, we hope the terminology guide and the allyship resource document will continue and we'll build out and always have this as a focus. Before June of 2020, our focus the previous conference year was what is that intersection of diversity, equity, and inclusion with student leadership programs? And then 2020 really took us into that deeper look at anti-racist work specifically within leadership. Oh, and before I move on to questions and comments, I did want to note as our pre-conference this year, I named Jordan Harper, who worked on the Leadership for Liberation framework. So he and our other pre-conference co-chair, Michelle Kurtz, they'll be leading a conversation and inviting speakers in, and it'll be focused on leading with an abolitionist imaginary. So I wanted to share with you the abstract. So I'll just read that quickly before I close out, because if you're showing up to this conversation, I think this pre-conference would be of interest to you in the work you do. So our abstract says, our survival is dependent on the dismantling of oppressive structures and systems such as capitalism and white supremacy. There is an urgency to inform students about these forces and prepare them to lead with an abolitionist imaginary, where these structures and systems are disassembled and new ones are erected. Participants will learn lessons from revolutionary movements, abolitionists in the academy, and each other to be better prepared to embed abolitionist logics and practices into leadership programs. So I did want to share that with you before I closed out. But Lindsay or Mike, if I missed anything that I can go deeper into, or we can open up for questions.
No, I think that's so great. Thank you for sharing that. And it just makes me think about, I'll see. Does anybody have any thoughts or comments or questions about what Liz showed us? Or thoughts about how you might use it or how you're thinking about it?
Thank you, Liz, for sharing with all of us. I think it's so powerful to have a resource like that really integrates different aspects of what we can advocate for in our leadership programs as well. I'm from Miami University here in Ohio, and I think this is something that will be really helpful for our leadership program with the students over here, as well as our advocacy programs through different departments. This year, we have a huge series on anti-racism and social justice. So I was just, you make me just reimagine many things, and I hope to be able to join other conversations in the close future. Thank you so much for sharing this.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline. And to your point, I think this resource, please don't hold it to yourself. Feel free to send on, and I think that's one of my favorite parts about this work is that we're easy to just say, hey, I think this is something you should look at. I'm here for questions. Thanks, Jack.
Yes, I agree. At Barry University, we have this anti-racism task force, and this would be a great resource. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Heidi.
Yeah, I wonder about how we bring it into higher education programs. You know, I think about like sharing it with our faculty here who are in our SAHI or HISA or whatever it's called on your campus. But, you know, as we're preparing folks to be in this space and to do this work, I think this is a really cool resource because, you know, a lot of higher ed programs have a social justice and higher ed class or a diversity, equity, inclusion class or something like that. And so I feel like this could be a really cool resource reading option for them in prep for joining, you know, the higher ed space. So I think it's a really, really cool resource. And I like that it gives collective language. I think in civic engagement and CLDE, we struggle a little bit with that. And I was glad to see you had the ERLIC or ERLIC definition for civic engagement. So I'm like, good, we use that. But you know, there's like so many definitions for the work that we do. What does community service mean? What does volunteerism mean? What does community engagement mean? What does it all mean? And I think DEI has a similar thread with that. And so does leadership. I mean, it's all in that boat. And so it just makes me grateful that we have some colleagues who are willing to put in the work to create something like this to help all of us kind of have some guidelines. I think in collective language, I think helps. Yeah.
Absolutely. That probably came from Amy or Spencer. So
other thoughts? I saw some folks are still processing, which I get. It's a lot to process, so that's fair.
Yeah, and I can pose a question if that's helpful. I'm curious how do you see this showing up in CLDE work? If that's something that you're specific to, because I know I'm outside of higher ed, but I work mostly with leadership educators. So how do you see it kind of helping in that work specifically? If anyone feels comfortable sharing.
Well, I don't want to be, Ryan, were you about to unmute? No, okay. So one of the goals that Mike and I have as co-chairs is to talk very honestly about the lack of diversity in CLDE work. And so if you go to like the CLDE annual meeting, which I've gone to 3 or 4 times, I think at this point, it is a really white space. And CLDE education or work in general is a pretty white space. You know, it was fascinating. We have a enough scholar in our office, and she was saying, she's like, do I want to go into this work? Like, I don't see many people that look like me. And so like, do I have a space here? And I'm like, you are exactly who we need to help cultivate to get into this space, to help kind of shift and broaden that narrative. And so I think as CLD, as we acknowledge and wrestle with that, I think this guide can help in, you know, if we're doing democracy work and we're doing voter engagement and we're doing civic learning and all these things that CLDE does and community engagement, like how are we preparing students to be active members of a community if they don't place themselves in that community? You know, like what does that look like? And so I think that there's a lot of application for a guide like this and a lot of conversations that I think we still need to have, because even if Mike and I have mentioned a number of times, even if you look at our leadership team mirrors diversity or not in CLDE work. And so I think we're just still trying to think about like what it looks like to be in this space and how we can bring in more voices who haven't been involved in this work, because we talk about, and I'm sorry, y'all, I love this conversation. But I think about like alternative spring break. That's how I got involved in CLDE work. You want to know what though? I had the opportunity to be able to take a week off, to not have to work, to have money to be able to pay to do ASB, to do, you know, and so like the people who have had the privilege of being involved in CLDE work are now the ones who are in the field doing the work. And so it just makes me reflect back on, you know, like how I got brought into the space and who maybe didn't have a chance to be involved or the opportunity to be involved. And so that is reflective now of the professionals that are in that space.
Thanks, Lindsay.
It's interesting you say that, Lindsay. I just actually talked about that at the Region 1 conference today about alternative break programming, and trying to create equitable access to those types of programs, because it does create a pipeline for not just for civic skill sets generally, not even if you don't go into the profession, and finding ways to, if it's staff institutionally, to provide more funding or some sort of subsidized rate for students to increase access. Because I was presenting about what we do at UConn for outbreaks, and some of the staff are like, well, how do students pay? And I'm like, well, student government, they have a longstanding relationship where they pay about half, and the students fundraise, and we give them the structure to fundraise so that students aren't forced to maybe like pick up extra work shifts or choose between outbreaks and groceries, like to give them some more structure and lead time. So it's, yeah, I think luckily the staff that were in those spaces had the privilege to go, and if they've continued in that work, are more likely to recognize who's not at the table when doing student recruitment for leadership and participants. So hopefully, cyclically, you see trends of more diverse students participating in that space, but that's not a quick fix or a quick turnover.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks, both of you. It's helpful to see what could those connector points be as we're moving forwards. That's extremely helpful.
And I think that's the trend in leadership education too. You know, that's where I have professionally fallen as leadership education. And it also made me think, I'm in a PhD program right now, and we read an article called Refusing the University. And if any of you want to look that up, y'all, it kind of like threw my whole world for a loop. It's about she asked the question of like, how do you be of a university but not in a university? Like, how do you be in a place where it wasn't meant for you? You know, like a lot of let me see, Ryan, if that's it. If it's from 2018, yeah, Sandy Grande. Yeah, she talks about how a lot of our institutions, you know, we talk about like social justice work, but social justice is still in the frame of like white supremacy sometimes and like white culture. And so like refusing the university is almost like decolonizing, like in my very low level, it's like burning it all down. And so like, what does that look like? It's a fascinating read. And I think just brings up a lot of these like social justice, anti-racist, white identity development, like critical theory kind of conversations that just feel like we've got so much work to do in order for us to be showing up for our students in the way that they need us to be. So, yeah. Any other thoughts or reflections or comments, folks? Awesome. Well, I don't want to be one of those Zoom people that's like, let's just sit here and stare at each other. You know, I know maybe we'll give you a little bit of time back in your day. Thank you, Liz, so much for sharing with us and for working so hard on this incredible resource and all the other things that the SLPKC is doing. Y'all are doing really phenomenal work. And so I appreciate what you brought to the space and what you shared with us. And so for the folks who are on the call with us, we will, again, this is recorded, so we'll share that for folks who weren't able to make it. And we will share the guide once it is available, so that you can use it, share widely with your friends, family, neighbors, whoever, anyone who does this work or might be interested in it. Feel free to look at the pre-cons that were mentioned, so our election one, but also the SLPKC. If you are going to NASPA, we'd love to see you there. And if you want to connect with us there, feel free. Liz put her email in the chat, so you can follow up with her if you'd like. And then, yeah, we'll share everything, resources and all the things that we can in relation to this anti-racism work. And please keep continuing the conversation and joining us in those spaces as we continue the dialogue. So any final comments, questions, thoughts?
I just want to say thank you again. This was the first time we've fully presented kind of what we're looking at, and we're so thankful for the collaboration between the KC. So we hope to continue that as well.
Awesome, thank you. Well, y'all enjoy the rest of your Wednesday, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.